You had fun finding golf balls, didn't you?
Yeah.
Maybe you'll start playing golf one day when you get bigger.
Yeah, everything will be fun.
Now, there's a little red light.
Yeah, it's recording.
Is it really?
Yep. So you were saying who built the house?
Well, the big house that my grandfather built
Yeah.
was before 1910. That was the big house.
Hunter, don't touch it, okay?
And my mother and father lived in it then, after they got married. And I was born in it.
If you do that, they'll fall down.
And we lived in it.
Hunter. Hunter, come over here.
Cry, you too.
We lived in it until probably 1923, I would say. I was about 12 or 13. And then a regular carpenter built the other house next to it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I lived from probably 1923 till 1933 when I got married.
Hmm.
I lived in that second house. The first house still looks good. Other people live in it, of course. But I think the one you mean that my grandfather built was the former big house.
Yeah, you told me about that.
Yeah.
He made it for your parents when they got married,
That's
right?
true.
What was his name, your grandpa?
Well, his true name was Tolf Kristofferson, because he was born in Bergen, Norway.
Mm-hmm.
But when he got to New York, he didn't want anybody to think he was a foreigner. So he went to the city hall or wherever you go and changed his name from Tolf Kristofferson to Charlie Brown.
Oh, I see. That's why you were...
Of all the names to pick.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Of course, he couldn't speak much English, but he wanted to have an American name. And he and my grandmother, Emily Hansen, were married in Norway. Came over to New York, and that's when he changed his name. I would like to have had him keep it, because that's a good Norwegian name.
Right.
But he changed it to Charlie Brown. He could have picked anything else, but that's the one he chose.
Hmm.
And then they moved to Olympia, and he had 7 boys and a girl. And the girl was my mother.
Hilda Brown? What was her name? Hilda, right?
Her name was Hilda Brown.
Hmm.
Should have been Hilda Kristofferson, but it turned out to be Hilda Brown. And then she married my father, so she went from Brown to Jones.
And what about all of her brothers?
Well, they just died one way and another. One was drowned, and back in those days they had a lot of diseases that people didn't know how to treat, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So there was only one boy survived. I knew him. He was my only uncle I ever had.
Mm-hmm.
His name was also Charlie Brown.
Oh, really?
And my grandmother's name was Emily Hansen.
Mm-hmm.
And she wanted so much to have a girl that she could name Emily. But she kept having boys. So when she had her 7th boy, she gave up and she named him Emil, changing the Y to an E.
Mm-hmm.
So his name was Emil. And then
Finally.
she had my mother.
Mm-hmm.
It was too late to use Emily, so her name was Hilda.
Hmm.
But my middle name is Emily.
Hmm.
And then my mother wanted me to name Judy Emil just because that was a true name that had come down through her family. So Judy's middle name is Emil.
Hmm.
And she'd just as soon it would be Emily, but then we don't have any choice about that.
And is it the one that went to Alaska was Miss Hansen?
Emily Hansen went to Alaska when they were having the gold rush.
Mm-hmm.
why a woman would go up there alone and leave the husband home with all those children. I never figured that out. But my grandfather stayed at home with all the children, and she went to Alaska to do something about the gold rush, whether they had property or I don't know. And she died up there. And she's buried up there. I happen to have a picture of her grave, but nobody ever told me why they didn't bring her home. They left her up there in Alaska. Strange.
What city was that in, do you know?
I don't know.
Huh.
I could look it up. So my grandfather then in turn raised all the children by himself. And one by one, something happened to them. Their first name, everybody's first name was Carl, spelled with a K. And their middle names were Cedar and Ludwig. My grandfather was using old Norwegian names. I don't know why he changed his mind after he got American, but and Cedar, like Carl Cedar, and Carl Ludwig, all except Charlie, and his name was Emil. So that was the family.
And he was the one that built the house. He was a good house builder, huh?
He's the one that built the house and gave it to my parents when they were married. And as I say, that's where I was born. They didn't go to the hospital too much in those days. They just sort of made do.
And so that was in Lacey? The house is in Lacey, huh?
They had the doctor. Old Dr. Story, they used to call him. I guess that was his name. And we lived there till I was probably starting high school. But then the house next door was built by a contractor. And we moved over there and lived there till, well, the folks lived there till 1970. I'd have to figure that out. 72. No, 69. And then they moved out to Panorama City, which is assisted living. My mother passed away in 69, and my dad lived to be at 72, and he was almost 90.
Wow.
He didn't get to be quite 90.
And so he was Mr. Jones.
Yeah.
Henry Jones? Or what was his name?
Elmer.
Elmer Jones.
Elmer Jones.
And where was he born?
And he had one brother and one sister that both passed away early. So he was actually almost raised as an only child too, of which I am one.
So Elmer was born in Olympia as well?
Elmer was born in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin.
Oh, okay.
The Joneses are from Wales, Welchmen.